thanks again for the invite and for allowing us to discuss and debate this issue. Now, I want to start, over a year ago, I was in Umeå, that's northern Sweden, for a conference. It was an architecture conference. And one of the keynote speakers was Dana Cuff from UCLA, from City Lab. You see here a slide from the entry in the Venice Biennale a few years ago. And one of the projects she spoke about, and the images she showed us, was really about this kind of pop-up street furniture, kind of funky street furniture in Los Angeles. What was interesting for me was to see the reaction of the audience, which started kind of moving in awkwardness, kind of dissatisfaction, which was very clear. And I'll come back to that moment in a second. But many of those at that conference belong to a kind of loose movement, which doesn't have a name or perhaps has too many names, right? Whether we call it tactical urbanism, DIY urbanism, participatory urbanism, everyday urbanism. And of course, difficulty of definition is also because of the breadth of the projects involved, and also the fact that we're talking about spatial practitioners, as they call themselves, artists, architects, urban designers, and so on. And sometimes it's about appropriating unused spaces, creating temporary communities, empowering locals in all kinds of ways, inserting everyday life into what is otherwise perhaps vacuous urban spaces, about a consciousness of the environment and empowerment of locals and so on. So this is some of the background of this movement and some of the projects of what we are talking about. And as I said, a lot of those at the conference came from this kind of background, whether as academics or activists. And I want to go to another kind of perhaps awkward moment, which happened already 5 years ago at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam. It was a masterclass, and it was run by Teddy Cruz, one of the best-known names related to this movement. He was assisted by Jeanne van Heswijk, an artist, and Miguel Lopez Duran, an architect. And all three, I have to say, are politically and socially committed individuals. And in this 5-day masterclass, they studied a deprived neighborhood in Rotterdam, and more specifically this street market, Afrikaanse market in Rotterdam, an open street market. And the analysis emerging showed that it is over-regulated by the city council. Too much regulation, too tight control, and the proposals by the students were basically to liberalize, deregulate the market. Now, I came in as a guest critic on the last day, last presentations, and of course I found that a bit weird. Why would these politically and socially committed individuals steer a group towards liberalizing and deregulating the marketplace? Now, of course, I think we are all aware that there are many regulatory structures which are there to help speculation rather than prevent speculation. We can think of the city grid, the iron grid of Philadelphia or Manhattan as such examples which allow speculation in property. But here we find explanation in this booklet produced by the students. I'll read from a slide which is slightly clearer. It's a quote the students make from something Teddy Cruz said, and he says, "There is a contradiction here. While the neoliberalist idea of the free market operating at the large scale of the corporate has benefited deregulation, individual freedoms and illegality, its approach to the small scale of the street market in many cities across Europe has operated as a repressive system of over-regulation and control, eroding the informal manifestations of diversity and social relations that can promote economic sustainability at the scale of the neighborhood." So fair enough, the argument is there, right? The state as a kind of adversary and so on. In this case, I actually happen to know the case study, and I know that what Teddy Cruz says here is not true, because what we have here is not so much the effects of neoliberalism on the street market, but the reverse. What we have is what we may call the irreducible remainder of a different era of tight control by centralized governments, right? Actually of the welfare state. Something which has not been assimilated into the neoliberal order, if you like. So I was puzzled, of course, even baffled by the fact that they kind of mistake their adversary and mix up the things. And I'm a bit concerned because this is not one-off incident, it's quite typical. But I want to go back to the issue of Dana Cuff and her slideshow. And what she was indicted for by the audience was this issue of gentrification, which we heard about just earlier. And gentrification is often the way that this entire movement gets indicted. So I want to look at this a little bit, at what this means. I'm going to use a rather narrow definition, but a familiar one, I hope, and saying that gentrification is about residential rehabilitation first and foremost, right? And there's competing, of course, definitions. The replacement of a weaker social group, and we're talking about class, right? Workers, poor and migrants in a specific urban area by a more affluent group of middle-class residents. Now, perhaps the most familiar explanation comes from Neil Smith, right? Already in 1979, he really had his rent gap theory. And it's really about this idea that because of disinvestment, what opens is a kind of gap between land rent, actual land rent, and the potential land rent, right? If the use would change, there could be much more land rent. So this investment brings about this opening of the gap, which encourages reinvestment. And that's fair enough, but with this definition alone, if we don't add anything else, we're left with a condition which seems like a natural occurrence in a, let's say, free market condition in cities, where areas fluctuate and so on. There's another argument coming from Peter Marcuse, the urbanist from the 1980s, and he tries to frame gentrification as part of a much bigger restructuring of society and of cities. And this story is really about how cities and societies changed, this passage from what we may call Fordism to post-Fordism, from Keynesian economy to neoliberal economy, industrial society to post-industrial, state capitalism to late capitalism. These different monikers, of course, frame different issues, but they're all part of that bigger transformation. And together we can understand that gentrification, if we accept Marcuse's argument, is actually a historical phenomenon. It's not something which is always part of cities. It is specifically to allow this transition. And this transition is really about the retaking or reclamation of inner cities. And reclamation, I wouldn't say necessarily only about the more affluent, professional, white-collar employees entering these neighborhoods, but also about capital. So that's part of the transition to a different type of city in which these inner city areas inhabited, as I said, by poor, unemployed, what was left actually from industrial production, we had unskilled laborers who no longer now have work, they're taken over by others. Now, this transition has also a lot to do with a change in what we may call consciousness, worldview, and so on. And if we zoom back, let's say 100 years or so, we'll find dominating the agenda what we call the social critique of society. And the social critique of society, which was formulated in the 19th century, is really, and Luc Boltanski and Chapello write about that, it's really about this demand for higher wages, job security, and those basic needs. Now, at the same time in the 19th century, marginal artist groups, art for art's sake and so on, formulated another critique that's called the artistic critique of society. And that is basically the demand for more creativity, more freedom, more spontaneity, self-expression, and difference. And the artistic critique of society at the time was, of course, a critique of a kind of utilitarian Philistine society around it. And what we see with this transition from restructuring of society is one in which the artistic critique comes to dominate at the expense of the social critique, right? And we see this first happening maybe at 68, May 68, with some of the student groups involved in the protests. They demand actually creativity, freedom, self-expression, self-realization, and difference. We can understand that also as a result of a more affluent West following the boom of the 1950s and early 60s, meaning that the discussion of basic needs is now superseded by the discussion of desires and more spiritual needs. Now, if we go back to the question of gentrification, and the term was of course coined by Ruth Glass, right, in 1964, looking at Islington, where she was living. And I want to move forward though to 1984, where quite a seminal text by Rosalind Deutsch and Cara Ryan is published, and it looks at the gentrification taking place in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the area now known as the East Village. And they associate this gentrification with the entry or the emergence of a specific art scene in this neighborhood, galleries, artists, and so on. And they try to tie these two phenomena together, and they actually, if you like, indict the entire movement there as responsible, if you like, for what's going on and the dislocation of poor locals from this neighborhood. Now, their conclusion is quite grim. It's actually, they call on artists simply not to take part in this, not to live in these areas, not to work in these areas, and so on. And we'll come back to that argument a bit later. But it's interesting that also Neil Smith was studying the same area and showing this rent gap in the Lower East Side in these years, where you would buy a plot for, let's say, $50,000, and because of the rising potential, you could sell it in a couple of years for $150,000 without having to invest anything in that area. And also important in this article that, you know, while we think of these fluctuations in New York and Manhattan as dependent only on real estate, Ryan and Deutsch show that the City Council took part in this, right? There are certain examples of, let's say, a building on Tompkins Square Park which was given to artists. So there are deliberate interventions, even if rather limited. If we want to fast forward to more recent times and speak about how gentrification and regeneration happens today, here in the UK, the name Urban Splash often pops up simply because they are perhaps the most cutting edge. And they call themselves urban regeneration specialists. So what does Urban Splash do? They normally go into a deprived area of, well, it can be Salford, Manchester, or elsewhere. They identify the most hideous building, let's say, they knock it down. Knocking it down means also the dislocation of council tenants, typically, and the reduction of council tenants is one of the key aspects of regeneration here. And they would invite some funky architects like Fat to design and build homes for the lower middle class. And lower middle class because we're talking about a group which doesn't have so much choice. If you're lower middle class, you can buy here perhaps a home with a garden and you can't buy it over there, so you're very limited. But also important for our discussion today is that Urban Splash invest in cultural activities. So they will organize a block party, all kinds of events around culture, and that is intended to change the perspective and to change the image and identity of the area. Because we are talking about areas which carry stigma. So they would carry out these activities, bring in the lower middle class elements who have less choice, and this would be followed by building more luxury homes where they make higher profits. And that's just one example. Now, if this seems rather sophisticated, then we have to look at what happened in places like Stockholm, Copenhagen, or here Amsterdam. In this neighborhood in Amsterdam, what happened was that the urban regeneration was actually a public-private partnership, but without any corporations, which is by contract and agreement. So the housing associations take care of the housing stock, renovation. Important aspect is reduction of social tenancy. So in this case of this neighborhood, 87% social housing was reduced to 70%. Netherlands being the Netherlands, those tenants were not thrown out to the street, they were given social housing elsewhere. But this elsewhere is the city periphery, places which are less desirable and have less potential. So they've been moved out of inner city. That 17% is of course renovated and sold at the free market. And the city council in turn takes care of culture. So they invest in cultural events also to change the identity of the area and its image in the wider public. Again, the first homes to go on sale for the free market are lower middle class. Then afterwards, the more luxury homes. Now, also what's very typical here is that you get the homes of the students. Now, if you visit the Netherlands and you bump into these kind of structures, you know, this is an area of interest, an area of real estate potential. Students are used as kind of foot soldiers of gentrification, and again, because they are middle class on average and don't have much economic leverage. So if you're a student and you're given a place to live for cheap, you say thank you. This goes hand in hand with artists getting ateliers, studios in these kind of spaces, and later moved on. So this happens when homes are being sold, and these are moved on, right? Like these kind of pioneering elements into areas of interest. And if these look quite fun and funky, you can just look at the photos from a bit of a distance and another angle, and it looks slightly less exciting. So again, they have a specific role here, and it's very difficult for them to say no. For the artists also who works at the studios, again, middle class people who don't have so much choice. So this is all part of a very planned program in which we can actually see the decisions being made. As I said, it's also about programming. And an artist like Janne van Heswijk was part of that masterclass with Teddy Kroos in Berlage. She ran such programs in Ypenburg and here in the Blue House in Eiburg. And she was specifically getting a subsidy to run some kind of cultural activity. So this is very different from that kind of situation where an artist called in to make a nice statue for the city square. It's about content. In a way, it doesn't matter if she is critical or not critical, because the role to be filled is something else. So we are talking specifically about areas which seem to the outside world a bit vacuous and in which the artists play their role. So we can talk about no longer the beautification of neighborhoods, but art used to infuse vitality and creativity into vacuous urban areas. And of course, art is appreciated by the target home buyers, who are typically professionals, middle class, It's not that they necessarily go to see so much exhibitions, but they value the presence of art to some degree. And these neighborhoods, which previously received very bad media attention because of crime, now receive better media attention, so it's about changing the stigma. Art is very good at getting this media attention because it is about creativity and difference and innovation. So it's very good at getting media attention and helping in changing this aspect. We talk about the hipness factor, if you like. And artists themselves, being middle class, are of course preferred by the potential buyers as neighbors than, let's say, the local drug pusher or something else. So this has become part and parcel of current developments. Thing is, of course, if we think about the movement we are talking about, it's quite different from Lower East Side, because in the Lower East Side, those galleries were really about art for art's sake, about autonomous art. The movement we are talking about is about transforming the city for the better. It's about engaging with the locals. It's about a social consciousness. So it's a very different kind of prospect and ambition, if you like. So, you know, if we look at Deutsch and Ryan's argument that artists should simply not be involved, we are, after all, not talking about art which even doesn't want to be seen often as art. So how do we actually try and judge its participation or lack of participation in gentrification? I think when we start looking, we find that different projects work out differently. If we talk about a kind of green van driving around deprived neighborhoods serving cocktails, we have to read that as a kind of vehicle of gentrification. And if we see some projects which reclaim empty plots and build temporary structures and have a program which is directed to creators, if you like, to middle-class creators like us sitting here, perhaps that is also a kind of machine for gentrification. And yet if we start looking project by project, we will find some which are different, some which are perhaps less visible in the media, some which engage directly with the most deprived locals and so on. So it's very difficult to use that kind of Deutsch and Ryan's approach to try and criticize the entire movement in question. It's easier to look at specific projects and each one. And what I'm looking for is trying to find this kind of fault line which is difficult to identify, but I'm also wondering whether this is the wrong thing we are looking for. Because when we look at deprived neighborhoods, we typically find the same question and the same issues. Isn't bettering a neighborhood really about, you know, creating better public space, job opportunities, making the schools better, dealing with the housing stock, more affordable housing? It's often the very same issues, and while we may disagree about what constitutes a better public space, there's a consensus about the broad aspects of this, whether it's top-down or bottom-up. So I would say perhaps the issue here is something else completely. Maybe it's about the fact that even if transformation happens and a kind which doesn't have programmed into it this location, like in the two examples I showed you from Urban Splash or Amsterdam, even then you have the vulnerable groups in society, which are the free market renters, but they get pushed out by the rise in real estate value. In other words, if we make a neighborhood better by any means we have, we will also cause inevitably dislocation to free market renters. So maybe the issue is actually security of tenure more than anything else. And again, security of tenure in the UK, we're talking about really the 1988 Housing Act, which meant that it's very easy to remove free market renters. And actually the council tenants and homeowners are the more protected groups here. But again, maybe we are splitting hairs, because if you take a step back and look at the distance of what we are doing here, and you look at all of these commendable efforts, and we're talking about, you know, urban acupuncture, we're talking about retrofitting, about micro-interventions, aren't we trying to battle a kind of bulldozer with little pins? Why not use some more effective stuff? I don't know, the baseball bat, the nuclear option, if you like. And I would call the plan the nuclear option. Why are we so afraid to speak about the plan? What is the plan? I mean, if we're talking about economics, Keynesian economics, we may dislike them to some degree, but Keynesian economics know how to deal with speculative crashes and crises like the ones we had in 2007 and 2008. We have the solution. So why are we so afraid of it? And it's not just about economic planning, it's also about spatial planning. If we're talking about London and the crazy stuff going with real estate right now in London, you know, I mean, the spatial planning is a way of preventing speculation in the property market and in real estate. So why are we so afraid of the plan?